Delhi. We welcome to this webinar on India's Global Climate Cooperation and the COP28. So since we have an hour of presentations, discussions from the speakers, I'm going to quickly jump in and start. So welcome, and we're so happy to have you here. So this webinar is going to basically discuss our edited report by Dr. Constantino Xavier and Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, who are fellow at CSEP and non-resident fellow at CSEP and research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. This report basically discusses 7 case studies on India's climate diplomacy and India's engagement at the international level on this front. And the report offers research-based, actionable foreign policy recommendations and options for India to accelerate its green transition to reach its 2030 targets and 2070 targets on its low carbon ambitions. So the context of this report, and to give you a basic idea on how we came about this, is India has seen an evolving climate diplomacy. So at Rio, when the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was formulated, India played a great role. And since 1992, India has been an advocate for having development as one of the main pillars and the main agenda of the climate change negotiations. And this we have been seeing as there's been a recent fragmentation of the geopolitical context. We see multiple other frameworks coming in, minilateral, multilateral, bilateral. And as India is as the UNFCCC is seeing a little bit of a fragmentation, India is now proactively innovating and also joining many of these new climate frameworks. So this climate diplomacy, diversification, and innovation is throwing up multiple challenges as well as opportunities for India. India has recently developed the International Solar Alliance, which we'll have Vyoma talk to us about, and also CDRI, which is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Both of them came out of COP21 in Paris. So India has been taking up a key role in innovating and also joining multiple other frameworks. So despite this, all of these frameworks often have overlapping agendas, issues that they take into account, and India doesn't have a comprehensive climate strategy to address its low carbon transition. And this report aims to give some direction and some foreign policy options for India to do this. So the report identifies mainly 4 tracks, which are multilateral, minilateral, triangular, and bilateral. And the report is structured in a way that goes through these 4 tracks in this order. So along the multilateral track, this is when we discuss the UNFCCC agencies like the International Energy Agency, International Energy Agency for Renewable Energy. So our report, the first policy brief in our report, is on climate transparency in India's leadership. This discusses how India has actually been coordinating in the UNFCCC, and it has been taking a huge leadership role. So this policy brief by Jhalak Agarwal and Sumit Prasad discusses the enhanced transparency framework, which discusses how India reports on its nationally determined contributions at COP. And it showcases that India has actually performed really well and is taking a leadership role in this framework. The second policy brief by our colleagues at the IEA discusses how India is engaging with the International Energy Agency, how this agency that was actually set up by the OECD countries back in the 1970s is now also expanding its agenda to multiple other sectors, mainly specific to energy transition, and how it's also expanding its regional ambit. So India has been an associate member and is now also looking for membership of the IEA. On the minilateral front, we have a policy brief on the International Solar Alliance by Vyoma, who will be discussing this further. And it was set up, like I mentioned, in 2015 as part of COP21 in Paris. And the second policy brief under this is the Quad. And this is by Aparna Roy at ORF and Charmi Mehta, who discuss that how India is playing a role in the climate working group of the Quad, and how this can then be leveraged for India to have more of a climate narrative in the Quad, even though this hasn't come out yet, but how India can leverage this for the same. Under triangular cooperation, we have a policy brief by Pooja Ramamurthi, who discusses how India can further use triangular development partnerships to further its agenda on technology transfer for climate transition, and have knowledge centers to promote the idea of South-South climate cooperation. Under the bilateral track, so we've seen these multiple various developments. India is engaging with various developed countries such as the US, the EU, Germany, and Japan. And our brief discusses two policy briefs, one on the India-US Clean Energy Partnership. Our colleagues at ORF America have written on how this has developed. They've looked at the various joint statements that have come out, and how even though India's bilateral engagements focus on multiple sectors, India has been trying to fit in a climate narrative into its bilateral engagements. The last and final policy brief in our report, and also in its bilateral track, is by Axel Nordenstam, and who will be discussing this further later. And it's on mapping India-EU climate relations. And he discusses how India has engaged with various multiple both states and member nations of the EU and the EU itself, and how those developments have taken place on and how climate has become a central agenda for many of these discussions. So the report also offers a few policy options for India to bolster its climate diplomacy. The first is appointing a Prime Minister Special Envoy for Climate Cooperation. This is a position that we actually had in the government from 2007 to 2010. This is a cabinet rank position which was responsible for convening and coordinating with agencies internally, domestically, as well as formulating the stance that India would have internationally on multiple climate cooperation platforms. And it was key in developing India's stance. And the report suggests that this would help India coordinate and formulate a more nuanced strategy for climate cooperation. And this is one of the key policy options that the editors have put out. The second is to develop a climate cooperation division at MEA. So the MEA has recently seen a restructuring and a reformulation. It has developed more region-specific and sector-specific divisions, such as the Indo-Pacific division and the division on new and renewable energy. So the report offers that having a climate cooperation division at the MEA would help direct a lot of the international cooperation that India aims to do and is already doing, and will cut down a lot of the roadblocks that we're facing. The third policy option is to have a secretary-level position at the MEA. So this is to then help uplift climate and climate action as an agenda for international coordination. The editor suggests that having a position which is similar to the secretary rank position of Secretary East or Secretary North, West, BM, it would help put climate on the forefront of India's foreign policy. And the fourth policy recommendation is to have a climate wing at India's diplomatic missions abroad. Many of the other countries, such as various EU member nations, the US, China, already have a climate wing, which has specific officers that look at the country's climate diplomacy and how they function, how they engage with other countries. So the editor suggests that having something similar at India's missions would again help direct India's climate strategy. So our report was launched last month, sorry, and we had Dr. Ajay Mathur, who is the Director General of the International Solar Alliance, give the keynote remarks. We had Professor Navroz Dubash from CPR, Ambassador Shyam Saran, who was actually the climate envoy from 2007 to 2010, come and join us, give us a few remarks. And we had Professor Dhanashree Jairam from Manipal University, who's also an expert on climate security, come and join us. And it was a well-received report launch, everybody. And you can find the press release online if you want. These are some of the learnings that the report comes out with. The main one is to enhance climate finance and to look into things like the development of the multilateral development banks, including more private sector into financing climate mitigation as well as climate adaptation. The second is in an increased focus and centrality to the global south, which is again something that India is advocating for, and to put in more needs of technology transfer, more coordination on the forefront, specifically related to climate. And the third is the need to improve domestic policy coordination and institutional capacities. So we at CSEP, under the foreign policy vertical, are looking at the first two, specifically in the upcoming research agendas. We in fact held two roundtables in October, one on climate finance and how India can leverage multiple institutions, cooperate, look at multiple institutions for enhancing climate finance, and also on the role of Global South. So Dr. Xavier and Dr. Nachiappan will be leading the work on climate finance, and Pooja here will be leading the work on the Global South. So I will now I will offer it up to Vyoma, Pooja, and Axel to take it further and talk about their own specific policy briefs. Thank you so much. We'll start with Vyoma, following the same pattern. And we'll follow Vyoma, then go to Pooja, who'll be discussing triangular climate cooperation, and then go to Axel, who'll be discussing the bilateral track.
Thank you so much, Anandita. I hope everybody can hear me. So before I begin, I want to really start by thanking Constantino, Karthik, Pooja, and Anandita, the entire team at CSEP, for bringing everybody together for this collaboration. And it's been really enjoyable reading everybody's pieces over the last month now, and sort of learning so much about the different ways in which India has been engaging across different forums on climate change. And today I'm going to speak about one that India has sort of created and steered over the last now 7 years since the announcement at the Paris COP in 2015. Before I begin my remarks, just the usual academic disclaimer that the views I express here today are personal and don't necessarily reflect those of my employer or CSEP. But before I sort of launch into what or how India has been engaging across this minilateral kind of diplomacy, I'll give you a little primer on what exactly the International Solar Alliance is, how it came about, and why I title my brief "Bridging the Gap." And when I say the gap, that essentially is the gap between Indian climate policy and Indian strategic thinking. Now, the ISA was announced at the Paris COP in 2015, came at a very opportune time, sort of leading up to a very tense negotiations. All eyes were in India that year, especially its role in terms of either securing or scuttling a global climate deal. So it was very heavily watched what India would do, how it would sort of be at the negotiations. Could it be announcing something new? And the International Solar Alliance was a joint announcement by India and France on the first day of the Paris COP, and really sort of set the tone for a successful cooperative 2 weeks, which did end up in the agreement, in the Paris Agreement, and the new global climate deal that everybody had been waiting on. I argue in a lot of my work that the International Solar Alliance was an interesting shift in India's foreign policy, where climate change really became, for the first time, perhaps a focal point for how India was furthering its strategic interests. And I say this for two primary reasons. One was that it ended up being an illustration of how India was trying to take on a leadership role in a climate adjacent space, in this particular case, solar energy. So it was really trying to take ownership of, as it sort of identified at that time, a space that hadn't necessarily been addressed within the formal UNFCCC framework to a great extent. So the idea of really carving out a new international organization, which at that point of time, I'll just sort of add here quickly, was not a new international organization. It was merely an announcement of a new alliance. It took shape as a treaty-based organization later on. But the idea to make this announcement was to leverage, its own sort of power in a climate adjacent space and make the argument that A, India was serious about addressing climate change, and B, that India was also not going to play spoil sport at the Paris climate talks, as was sort of widely anticipated before the 2 weeks. The second reason for the sort of shift in terms of why climate change really started furthering India's strategic interest was that it provided an opportune moment for India to really assert its power at the global stage by creating a new international organization. And this was something that became very apparent after Paris and after the reception that India got for this announcement of the International Solar Alliance, which is meant to be an alliance of about 120 countries lying between the two tropics, so Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer. And the idea underlying this entire institution initially was that the countries with the maximum potential for deployment of solar energy are also the poorest and the most vulnerable countries in the world with little to no energy access. So the idea of bringing them together, creating a new voice, predominantly in the global south, given the geographies of the member states of the ISA, it really ended up being a new sort of leveraging a new geography to bring countries together and have them really become a common voice in terms of, asking for more finance and technology to enable not just energy access, but energy transition in these countries. But why do I then say that there is this sort of gap between, what was Indian climate policy and what was the Indian strategic thinking behind the ISA? And the reason for this is sort of threefold, as I lay out in the brief as well. And it is, one is to do with the legal form of the ISA, what it allows for, and maybe where it's falling short currently. The second is the sort of big question on finance and how that remains a missing link. And the third being whether the ISA really was, a first step in India's grand sort of climate strategy, so to speak. And I'll address each of these one by one. So in terms of, just the legal form of the ISA, it ended up becoming a treaty-based organization a year and a few days after its announcement. So, after its opening for ratification. So the formal text of the ISA treaty was tabled at the Marrakesh COP, and just a little bit before the next COP after that, ISA came into being in December of 2017. So it came into legal force. And even though it has the sort of hard shell of being a treaty-based organization, it provides for a lot of flexibilities in terms of how the treaty provisions operate. And I have argued in a lot of my writing that the sort of hybrid nature of the ISA, which really borrowed very heavily from what the Paris Agreement was also doing in terms of combining both a top-down as well as a bottom-up architecture of climate action. The treaty structure of the ISA really allowed for having legitimacy because of, the fact that countries were ratifying it, and yet it retained the flexibility in terms of how it would operate, how things would go forward. So the idea really was that it would be the participating actors, which included a variety of non-state actors from multilateral institutions, private institutions, financial institutions, non-state actors, NGOs, etc. So wide spectrum of non-state entities which became members of the ISA, and the idea was that they would take the implementation forward, and it would become an action-based organization. Or an action-oriented organization. They took great pains to distinguish themselves from the IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, which they believe was more research-based and sort of advocacy-focused. But even in the sort of 5.5, 6 years now of ISA being operational, it remains much more of a research-based organization, and it doesn't really have much to speak in terms of an action-oriented profile. A lot of the projects, a lot of the programs that the ISA is doing are sort of heavily focused across, advocacy and analysis, capacity building in the developing country, primarily the African countries, as well as small island developing states and least developed countries, and providing them programmatic support for projects to take off on the ground. So in terms of, the action-oriented nature of really mobilizing big finance, big money going into these regions of the world, the ISA still is sort of working towards that. And right now is sort of operating more in a research-focused manner. And this brings me to the next point of, the missing link on finance. The objective of the ISA when it was announced was to mobilize $1 trillion by 2030. Sorry. And right now it really is far away from the goal. There have been some consistent financial support provided to the ISA, but it's mostly been by France as well as India, which are the sort of co-hosts. And and in terms of really mobilizing the private sector investment, it remains well short of that mark. And finally, when one does think of it as a grand strategy in terms of Indian foreign policy, the first assembly of the ISA laid out the concept of one sun, one world, one grid, and really connecting different regions of the world under a common solar grid for sharing energy, for sharing of solar powered electricity. But there are massive issues with how this grid will come about, what the operationalization will look like, and really the kind of splintered implementation across different ministries currently in India. I'm happy to elaborate on this more, but again, I'm going to just stop my remarks here and hand it over to Pooja to just talk about India's engagement more with the trilateral ways of climate diplomacy. And
thank you so much for your comments, Vyoma. I am Pooja. I'm an associate fellow at CSEP, and yes, I also want to thank Anandita and Karthik and Constantino a lot for including me in this really exciting project. So I guess the reason I was motivated to write about this topic is because if you think about essentially what the world needs, what countries need to meet their climate goals, it's financing, of course, it's technology, and it's also capacity building and institutions. So these are your three main points when it comes to what countries need to meet their climate goals. And unfortunately, a lot of countries, especially in the global south and the developing world, don't have these. So a lot of the principles that were enshrined in a lot of climate negotiations was the assumption that the global north or the richer countries or the countries that were historically responsible would help countries the countries in the developing world meet these goals through the transfer of finance, tech, and capacity building. And so many of the conversations around COP, around global about global environmental cooperation tend to come from this very north-south paradigm, where the countries in the global north have to aid or help or have to provide these three things that I mentioned to the countries in the global south. But that was decades ago. I mean, things have changed. Like the global governance has changed. You have a lot of rising powers. You have a lot of understanding that maybe, especially when it comes to technology transfer and institutional building, you cannot blindly take a one-size-fits approach. So you cannot just take a technology or a policy or a financing in innovation, which has worked maybe in a European country, and then go and try to put it in like in some other country, which may not have the same social context, the same institutional capability, or even the same technology needs, right? So this led me to think that, you know, they need to, like, even if you read a lot of the findings from the COP, it's always very north-south. And I started to read more and more, and then I started to notice that there is a lot of work that is happening within the global south itself. There's a lot of work that's happening with regards to indigenous innovations. There's a really good paper in Nature that talks about how the global south is actually the unsung hero of this whole climate change movement. And then this made me realize that it would be exciting to study triangular cooperation, which basically moves away from this north-south paradigm and says that the north and the south can work together with one country in the south as a pivotal partner. And that actually made me realize that there can be a lot of global south-south collaboration, a lot of cooperation, and at the same time, we can get help, of course, from our partner countries in the north. So this was what motivated me to write about the policy brief, and I specifically look at the role that India can play, because we have been really involved in the past and also as well as now in a lot of countries in the global south. We have helped them, small island nations, LDCs. We work with both countries, like for example, we work with the US, the UK, and Japan on these triangular arrangements. But we also work with the big organizations. For example, India is the top contributor financially to the UNDP Financial South-South Collaboration Fund. So I find that we're actually doing a lot of work. We are working in this triangular space. But what is happening is that these projects tend to be very one-off. They don't seem to be systematic, and they seem to be fragmented. So we can't actually quantify the extent to which India has worked on climate change, what impact it has had. These projects don't tend to have a lot of monitoring and evaluation. We also don't tend to, as Anandita already said, we don't seem to have a centralized agency that monitors these climate change projects, and we also don't seem to have an institutionalization of it. So some of the recommendations that I make is, although India is doing a lot, it has a very important, it can be the bridge between the north and the south, and it has a really important part to play in enabling a global climate transition. Right now, we need more institutionalization of it. The Prime Minister announced a global center, Dakshin, which is a knowledge platform for exchange. We need to build on those things. We need to have non-state and state actors engaging in the process. We need a lot more monitoring and evaluation, and we also need to narrow down our focus, when we work on things in these triangular arrangements, we should have sector-specific pathways. And I think that climate and energy can be one of those pathways where India can really, really make a change and be a global sustainability leader. And at that, I think my time is up, so I will pass it on to my to Axel.
Thank you very much, Pooja, Vyoma, and Dita and CSEP as a collective for hosting me, not only for this webinar, but also for inviting me to contribute to this report. It's a very timely report, I think, and an important conversation to have. I'm Axel Nordenstam. I'm an associate fellow with the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and a doctoral student in international relations at Stockholm University and currently Delhi-based. So it's great to be here. Let me give you a brief summary of the chapter, because for those sitting in Delhi, it's 7:30, and we should really devote our time wisely. So, in a nutshell, what I'm arguing in my brief on the EU, on India's climate relations with the European Union, is actually a bit of a contrast to this standard reporting of climate surrounding in North-South divisions, because in spite of the historical differences and the historical different side taking by India and the European Union in climate negotiations, they have found ways to collaborate on climate action. So in my brief, I exhibit India's cooperation with European partners as a balancing act between two levels, between the level of between the EU level on the one hand, where Delhi reaches out to Brussels and collaborates with European Commission and EU institutions on the one hand, and the level of member states within the European Union, such as Germany, France, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands. And what I found in this brief and throughout my research that has been published here and there before is that India has chosen to enter those kinds of climate partnerships at both levels. So that means that India has basically conducted a balancing act between engaging on the EU level and the member state level. On the EU front, most significantly is the India-EU Clean Energy and Climate Partnership from 2016, signed a year after the Paris Agreement at COP28, which has laid the foundation for a concrete project and solar parks. But at the same time, India has entered those climate partnerships. So it's a really intriguing element for policy analysis. And that sparked me to also set up some analysis in this brief. And in a nutshell, I'm arguing that India should evaluate the balance between these two levels now and reflect about the resources allocated to implement the existing partnerships. So put very simply, India has existing partnerships at the moment. So now it's time to think about how to use them effectively and basically use those partnerships for Delhi's interests. Because clearly accelerating the green transition is a shared priority for the India-EU strategic partnerships. So the question is, how do we avoid redundancies and really use the existing frameworks at its best? So that's the brief in a couple of minutes, but let me share a couple of more points and elaborate a little bit further. The brief itself consists of one elaboration on India's engagement with EU institutions, followed by India's engagement with EU member states. And then in the end, I also lay out some options for Indian diplomacy with European partners. So for those interested, have a look on the content, but I'll go through some quick pointers. First, when it comes to India's engagement with EU institutions, I think a lot of things have happened since the past. In the past, ever since India entered diplomatic relations with the European Economic Community in the 1960s, and when India and the European Union had their difficulties in climate negotiations, we saw the first joint working group and an energy panel and joint declaration between India and the European Union in the time between 2005 and 2012. So that time set the foundations for some kind of climate cooperation, but it was very thin, to be frank. Some scholarship would suggest that was because of stumbling cooperation in general and also on trade. So after Paris, when India entered a clean energy and climate partnership with the European Union, that really set up the foundation for more concrete action with solar parks. And I think the fact that we saw a TTC, a Trade and Technology Council, adopted by and endorsed by both India and the European Union last year, all signifies and underlines the strategic importance of climate cooperation between the two blocs. And in the TTC itself, we have two working groups on climate-related issues. First, the resilient supply chains and the clean technologies. So on 2 out of 3 working groups within the TTC are actually composed of climate-related issues. And this is important for India moving forward. At the same time, we have also seen a bit of friction at the EU level, especially regarding to CBAM. And I elaborate a little bit on that in the brief. So I recommend people to look at that because that's a longer discussion. And India has also been able to attract a bit of investments with available finance from the European Investment Bank in the form of loans. So this is the brief summary of India's engagement on the EU level. On the member state level, interestingly, we've seen a surge of bilateral partnerships, not with all EU member states, because there are 27. That would be quite a huge task for Indian diplomacy, to be frank, but with a select group of EU member states. Vyoma touched about the most significant climate partnership, the International Solar Alliance, climate institution co-led by India and France, even though it seems to be very much that India takes the lead on it. So that is one example. Another example is the leadership group on industry transition that India co-leads with Sweden since 2019. And I list those in the brief. So those interesting can just open the brief and take a look on the table and get the overview. The interesting part is that we actually seen a gradual progression in terms of how those partnerships come about. It often starts with a couple of MOUs being signed, and then those are followed by partnerships. And the partnerships have often been announced in the presence of the Prime Minister at bilateral summits, at multilateral forums. So that suggests that the Prime Minister has used those partnerships to really underscore his position as a friend of the environment and in his interactions with European leaders. But another reason, as I lay out in the brief, could of course be that both India and European partners see business opportunities in those climate partnerships, which could be equally important. Before wrapping up, let me also draw the attention to the fact that some EU member states have chosen to join climate institutions co-led by India. So I present a little map in the brief where the reader can clearly see that there are some EU member states that have actually chosen to join India's climate institutions, but not all. And this for me motivates some thinking about what to do, what Indian diplomacy can do with European partners. And I think I could elaborate on that now, but I think I'll stop here and encourage people to read or reach out, and we can continue from here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vyoma, Pooja, and Axel, for giving us an overview of the brief and for delving into what the various tracks are, how India is engaging with them. So now just pivoting quickly to how India is going to engage at COP, I would want to get your views on how you think India is going to, what are the basic sectors or focus areas that India is going to be discussing maybe at the negotiations. There's been a lot of talk on discussions about climate finance featuring as one of the key policy and focus areas of the COP itself. And also there's been discussions on the Global South becoming key in taking forward a lot of the negotiations. So maybe starting with Axel and Pooja, Vyoma, you can chime in whenever and just maybe give us your views. What do you think?
Yeah, happily. I mean, this is a very important time, and also an important topic. I mean, from my perspective, I'm expecting India to push for renewable energy and also for climate finance. Those are two really hot topics for India at COP. Has been so in the past COPs. Historically, of course, India has always valued climate justice and equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So that pushes for on the responsibility side. I think we'll see some kind of on that front as well, especially when it comes to loss and damage at COP in UAE. But the most striking part that I'm expecting is that India will actually present itself as part of the solution. This has been one of the key objectives for India at COPs in the past 10 years, and I think the COP in Paris really signified that when India presented itself as part of the solution. But the option of initiating a new organization has already been used. That happened with the International Solar Alliance. So presenting itself as part of the solution may be a bit demanding, but I think that's definitely going to be one of the key elements for India at COP.
Yeah, I think I just want to chime in with this is that often if you see the way India has been reported from the COPs, it has been quite unfair actually, although India has constantly tried to has always put itself as an actor that wants to present itself as part of a solution. Often the reporting, and I would say a bit unfairly, has always kind of has placed India as someone who's opposing things, and so I think especially this year, one thing that India might push for is that when it comes to phasing down of fossil fuels, they might say not only on coal, but also to include natural gas in that, which a lot of Western countries have been pushing back on because obviously they use a lot of natural gas. So that might be one of the stances that we see in that India is taking. I think there will also be a lot of focus, of course, on being the voice of the global South and trying to portray itself as a country from the G20 that is presenting the interests of the global South. But one thing is important to note is that the global South is not always one block. For instance, a lot of small island nations and things like that are not really backing the argument of that we need to continue emitting in order to develop, because they are going to be the ones that are first going to be affected. So the funding might be used more on things that are more climate adaptation as opposed to mitigation. But yes, I think India will push a lot, as Axel said, for the loss and damage fund as well. And yeah, so I think those are some of the stances that we'll see. And of course, we will see India trying to push this whole life narrative, which is going to become more human-centric. And that is something that India, surprisingly, although its per capita emissions is so low, India has been really pushing for this behavioral and consumer level demand side change and a low carbon future, because I think something India has always said from the previous governments as well is that we are not going to take the path of the Western countries or other industrialized countries in high emission growth. We are always going to try at the same time to manage our emissions as we develop as well. So I think India might try to also push for this more human-centric approach towards addressing climate change.
I think just quickly coming in, I think what you said about life also tie in very well with, I think, the COP28 focus on having nature-based solutions. I think that's one of the key points that I think this COP is going to look at. So yeah, Vyoma, please go ahead.
I'm going to add a little to what I think both Pooja and Axel have laid out really well. And again, I think, key issues really on top of this COP's agenda from India's point of view might be, climate finance for sure, mission life, which is something that India has been steering for the last almost 2 COPs, and the fact that it was such a big part of the G20 leaders declaration as well. I think from my point of view, the big thing really to watch out for at this COP would be the sort of global renewable energy target, as well as the doubling of energy efficiency target. Both things were something that India really sort of worked hard to achieve consensus on for the New Delhi Leaders Declaration. And you can see the COP presidency, the UAE presidency also make that a major goal for them. And really from India's point of view, I think it ties a lot into how it is viewing finance and technology sort of moving into greater renewable energy projects at home as well as the broader developing world. Because, and again, I take the ISA example here, but also you see it with other sort of minilaterals that India is trying to create. Could be the CDRI, it could be the Lead It, most recently the Global Biofuel Alliance. You sort of see this pattern in India's diplomacy where they're creating new institutions, very sort of sector-specific institutions, which can then become the sort of venues to channelize more finance and technology into these specific sectors. And again, sort of all of them are operating near the UNFCCC universe, but not really within the UNFCCC universe. So you're leveraging bilateral relationships, you're leveraging private sector investment, you're really leveraging the business opportunities in a lot of these specific sectors, which are all crucial in the clean energy transition. So I think really from India's point of view, and this is really why we see these targets within the G20 leaders declaration under India's presidency as well, is that the idea of really setting a global target becomes a way for India to really argue for the ceiling and for all the finance and technologies to sort of match that ceiling, particularly in areas of the world where you need it the most. And again, becoming the voice of the global south, that is something that India has really been, a big champion of through the years. Again, inviting African Union to become a part of the G20, now the G21. We don't really know how the terminology will work going forward, but really how India lends itself to, or how India lends its voice to, steer more finance and more technology into these regions of the world, the global south particularly, will be critical, to not just how we are solving the problem of climate change, but critical to how India positions itself, within global climate governance.
Thank you. So I think adaptation may become one of the key focus areas that India looks at, because I think, which Vyoma, you also mentioned that for, domestic challenges are what, and I think our report also touches upon that India's climate diplomacy has often emanated from the domestic challenges that India faces, and then it actually puts them out in its foreign policy to help actually tackle those challenges back at home. And adaptation has been one of the key challenges. We see finance has not come in critically on multiple fronts, even on mitigation. I think the G20 Summers and Singh report discuss how much the financing gap is, $3 trillion US come in annually. And Axel and Pooja, you mentioned the loss and damage fund. I think there's been a huge controversy since last year. Some of the key questions about where it would be housed, who's going to be funding it, all of those were not discussed, and I think those are going to be a focus of this COP. So do you also see adaptation becoming one of the key focus areas of this upcoming COP?
Happy to go first briefly. Adaptation, I believe, has always been an issue at most COPs. I think most important, sort of in the last 10 years, I think the Cancun COP and the Cancun agreements were really the ones which brought adaptation front and center. And then, since then, there's been the sort of highs and lows of which year it really comes up during the negotiations. I think this year, with the operationalization of the funding mechanism to address loss and damage, that would be one key issue around adaptation. For sure, I think how countries get together and formally adopt the draft text, which came up, about 2 weeks back at Dubai. They had the 5th Transitional Committee meeting leading up to COP, and they do have a draft text in terms of, the kind of compromise that both the developed and the developing world seem to have come up with in terms of how this fund would work, where it might be housed, how it will be going forward. But I think even a formal adoption at this COP will leave a lot of work to be done in terms of really how the fund is functional going forward. Because again, I think, traditionally the multilateral space, the multilateral climate finance space has just done very poorly on adaptation finance. And that is the experience, with the Green Climate Fund as well, which was expected to do better than the sort of adaptation fund early on. So again, from India's perspective, it's interesting because I see, and this is my opinion, that the CDRI is a very adaptation focused initiative, where you are kind of creating this new entity, for making your infrastructure more climate resilient, and sort of both in the face of disasters as well as from a forward-looking point of view of just making existing infrastructure more resilient. So that again is, in my opinion, a unique initiative to really create a separate space, very sort of target, specific target for mobilizing finance around these kinds of initiatives.
Also, just maybe quickly thinking about one of the key issues that's going to come up at this COP is the global stocktake, which started at COP21 in Paris, and now is going to conclude. And the countries are supposed to submit their revisions and discuss their nationally determined contributions. So how do you think India is going to do? I think there's already been a few reports on this and what India is looking at. What do you think India is going to? What do you think is going to focus on? What is the thing that it's going to maybe bring up in negotiations? Pooja, you mentioned discussing the phase out of natural gas as well. So do you see all of this featuring in the way India then puts these negotiations forward in, say, the global stocktake?
So I think if you see a lot of, even at the G20 meeting, at the White House, in a lot of conversations, India states that it is the only G20 country which is actually going to meet its NDCs. It has constantly said this, and I'm sure it's going to reiterate this also at the COP. I think it is going to call out that other countries are not meeting the NDCs, and it is also. So in that way, and I think I'm not sure whether that's how true that statement is, but I do think India is more on track than a lot of Western countries, especially the UK government actually just came out now and said that no, we can't put this burden on our taxpayers, even if we don't meet our NDCs, too bad, but this is too much of of something to put on our taxpayers. So even if I think that's going to be our stance, that India is a climate leader. We are a sustainable leader. We want to remain so. We're not going to back out on our pledges. And I think that's going to be this. That's going to be the stance. Of course, a lot of organizations, a lot of critique says that India is not doing enough. Although the government says it's doing enough, there's been a lot of external comments saying India is not doing enough. So that is something that I think domestically India will have to deal with, but at least externally, I think this is going to be stance that we are doing enough. And I think it's going to push a lot of other countries to stick to their NDCs. I think it's going to push a lot of countries, especially historical emitters, to kind of not back out on their plans. So I think that's the role that India can play and should play, considering that we have been on track. And just one more thing, coming into the loss and damage that Vyoma was talking about, I think India sees itself as a country that can assist. I think India itself as an emerging economy has enough capacity and institutional capacity to deal with adaptation a lot domestically. When we look at climate finance as a nation, we always look for mitigation, for investments, for new technology. Like that's where India wants its money to come in, not so much like Pakistan dealt with this huge flood and like India has to negotiate. India is not in that situation right now. But I do think if India needs to be the voice of the global south and wants to really back up its intents, it's its intention that it needs to really voice out this global south need for loss and damage fund. So I think like it should, and I hope it does, really push for this. Axel, any last comments?
Yeah, on this front, I mean, I remember reading up for a little bit on COP now, and I think it's one of the things that Indian press has reported about, which to me seems fairly logical, is the fact that India is expected to push for a carbon negative trajectory for developed countries by 2050. So that's basically India's position in the net zero debate. That's which of course which is quite telling and it's quite concrete. Based on the outline that both Pooja and Vyoma just laid out here, that this is probably the position. Of course, it raises questions about what happens after 2050 for those who have reached climate neutrality as well. But I'm expecting some, so that's probably one of the potential contentions. And another potential contention is probably the phase down versus phase out of coal, which I expect to be re-upped at this COP, because it was highly present 2 years ago. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that would return to the...
Axel, quickly, just I think closing this with you soon. You'd mentioned you were there last year in Egypt at COP27, and I remember we were having a conversation before this. You mentioned that often, and I think this is the case in most events, like it's not always the big public events where all the discussions take place. Much of the negotiations often happens at much smaller events. And you being there, do you have any takeaways? What was your experience? What do you think? How do you think that is going to maybe feature into what actually comes out of this COP?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right that COP in itself is much wider than the general reporting. The general reporting, very rightly so, focuses on climate negotiations and what happens in the rooms, the contentions there, and has done so for ages. But as COP looks like, the format of the conference is that it comprises of two separate sides, the negotiations and the side events outside of the negotiations, where dialogue between stakeholders, private sector and civil society to take place. So that means that when you're present at COP, that means that you, as a participant, not a negotiator, but as a participant, means that you can actually follow both at the same time. For me, it was, when I was there last year, it was striking that India had a huge pavilion that hosted some conversations. There were also side events. Last year, we saw a leaded summit, for instance. This year, I'm hearing and I've seen press releases saying that there will be a new leaded summit and also that leaded 2.0 will be announced. Exactly what that comprises of, I guess we'll see in a couple of weeks. So that's on the side event side. On the and then of course the climate negotiations.
Thank you. And if Pooja, Vyoma, Axel, if any of you have any closing remarks, I think we can go ahead with those. And
a very quick closing remark, I think, really borrowing from what Axel pointed out about India's recent submission on the first global stock take to the UNFCCC. So India's official submission actually outlines the fact that the developed countries need to do more and they need to go sort of faster on their climate goals. And I think this, it's sort of, again, India sort of positioning itself as doing a lot more, being a leader in climate action, that all sort of leads up to its really kind of, long-standing stance of differentiated responsibility. And I think, it will really sort of stand strong in the fact that, India is now at a point where it is doing a lot on climate action. It is taking a lot more responsibility. And if the developed world is not meeting its earlier promises on finance, technology transfer under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, then it is just it's an inequitable way of moving forward with a common solution. So I think I think that really sort of is what you sense from India's official submission to the first global stocktake. So they will really hone in on the differentiated responsibility argument that they've had all along at climate negotiations.
Well, I think my closing remarks would just, kind of also reflect on my policy brief that India really does have a critical role to play as a bridging between the global north and the south. I think it's really well positioned because some of its issues and some of the domestic policies and innovations it has really feed into the goals that the global north is trying to achieve in the most vulnerable countries. And also by building these new institutions, by engaging with a lot of global north actors and the global south, I think India can be not only the voice of the global south, but can actually help accelerate climate action. And I think the COP, I think this will be the stance that India will try to play as well. And thank you for hosting this really great webinar as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot also from my side for hosting this webinar. And it really shows that climate negotiations can occupy a lot of us and can get a lot of attention. But the broader sense with the report, as far as I take it, is that India's global climate strategy is something that can take place throughout the year. So even though we're focused on COPs now, those upcoming 2 weeks of intense negotiations and a number of side events, there will be a time afterwards as well.
Thank you so much. And I think taking up from that, I would just want to say that Pooja is actually going to be leading our research on climate cooperation and the global south and how India looks at it, what India does. That's what Pooja is going to be doing. So you can look out for her work on that. Dr. Xavier and Dr. Nachiappan are going to be looking at climate finance and NRDC reforms, which is again upcoming work that we're doing at CSEP. We recently had Dr. Veda Vaidyanathan join us, who is also going to be looking at how India engages with partners in Africa. So we have a lot of exciting work happening. So I hope everybody is on the lookout for everything that happens. And I would like to thank Axel, Pooja, Vyoma for making time, for joining, and everybody at CSEP, all the participants as well for joining. It's really late in the evening in India, very early in the morning in the US. So thank you so much, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so